Well, there were really two bombshells that he dropped on the other NATO defense ministers just then. The first is what you just heard in that clip, where he is saying the U.S. doesn't support going back to the pre-2014 borders, or at least that shouldn't be an objective in the negotiations because it's unrealistic. The second is that he said that the U.S. also does not support Ukraine's membership in NATO as part of those negotiations. Now, I don't think the ministers could be said to be so surprised by that, or they shouldn't be surprised at least, because this is what the Trump administration has been signaling for a long time. But there are a lot of people here in Europe that did not believe that that would actually be the position. Hegseth has here spelled it out. And what will make the Ukrainians very nervous now is that, of course, going into a negotiation, you always want to come to say that Ukraine would have to cede some of that pre-2014 territory to Russia because they wanted that to be worked out in the negotiation. And the fear was saying that out loud ahead of the negotiations with Russia already is making a major surrender to Moscow. So the fact that the U.S. has now said that it doesn't support either NATO membership or pre-2014 borders ahead of those negotiations means Ukraine will be entering those negotiations severely weakened. Now, is it a realistic assessment to say that there was very little chance that Ukraine was, for instance, going to have Crimea as part of its territory after a negotiated peace settlement? Of course, and everyone in Europe knew that. The problem is Hegseth saying that. So I think at NATO right now, there are a lot of people running around with their heads on fire trying to figure out how this positions Ukraine in terms of those negotiations.
And Dave, look, as you say, one of the key issues for the Trump administration is that European members of NATO spend far more money on the defence of Ukraine than the United States does. What are the chances then that we actually will see tangible change in how much money European countries are putting in?
Well, it's strange to be talking about equalizing the support for Ukraine, as Secretary General Rutte was just talking about, because already Europe spends more on Ukrainian military aid than the United States, but barely more. I think it's something like 52%. So it's basically half and half European, half American. That is equalized by definition. Now, if you pull half of the support coming from the U.S. out of the equation, Ukraine is really in trouble. Obviously, the U.S. is shouldering much more of a burden than any individual NATO country, but it is also much, much larger than any other individual NATO country. But the plan is, the countries have been ramping up their defense. They are almost all exceeding that 2% target, all except Spain and Italy. But now the Trump administration is asking them to go further, up to 5%. Today, Secretary General Rutte was talking about upwards of 3% or above 3%. So I think there are intentions of increasing spending. The big debate right now is how do you increase that spending? France is warning that just increasing the spending while still buying all of the military equipment from the United States, which is where the majority comes from now, isn't doing anything to lessen Europe's dependencies, particularly its dependency on the United States. France wants that new spending, particularly as part of the EU budget, to be spent in Europe only for that military equipment. That's meeting major pushback from Eastern EU, NATO countries, EU member states, and also from the UK, who say it's just not realistic that the European industrial capacity could provide those weapons. So there's a big debate on how that increase in spending is going to be happening, but everyone is on the same page that Europe needs to increase its military spending. There is nobody, no leader of any country, no thinker, no one in Europe is denying that that needs to happen.
Dave Keating in Brussels, thanks very much indeed. Well, let's take a quick look then at what